were not ignorant of it. Mr. McGurn had foreseen that very prospect in the journal as early as 2003, but he was strangely silent thereafter when the persecution was widespread, murderous, and rampant. Mr. McGurn did not respond to a request for comment for this article. So today's strange professional Catholic silence regarding Ron Paul is not surprising, even though he is a champion of every Catholic conservatives believe in. It's humorous, really. Pro-life Catholics are often ridiculed as being single-issue voters. However, pro-war Catholic neocons, to whom the war was the paramount issue, don't have to deal with that criticism. Take Rick Santorum, who seizes every opportunity to condemn Ron Paul's foreign policy of defending America rather than exporting secular democracy. Santorum is at the bottom of the polls because he toured Pennsylvania with George W. Bush in 2004, supporting the re-election of Senator Arlen Specter, the ardently pro-choice Specter was the #1 target of pro-life groups nationwide. But for Santorum, backing Bush's war was apparently more important than the life issues. As a result, he lost his own election bid by 20 points in 2006, with the help of my vote, I might add. Continuing on. Santorum is a sore loser. He can't stand Ron Paul because Dr. Paul's very presence mocks Santorum's hypocrisy, not to mention his oversized ego. On polls, Santorum is regularly in the 1% range, while Ron Paul heads for the first tier as one GOP pygmy presidential after another takes a tumble. Santorum proudly sings his own praises as a family man, but can't find a kind word for the doctor who has delivered 4,000 babies without ever seeing a medical case that required abortion. The petulant Santorum doesn't aim his spiteful cheap shots at his fellow pygmies, several of whom know nothing about foreign policy besides chanting the Stop Iran mantra. He blasts Ron Paul, who has spent years on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and who towers above him in consistency and principle. But Santorum is a player. He became a hero to pro-life Catholics when he opposed partial birth abortion in the 1990s. He knows that more than 1% of Republican primary voters are pro-life and is vexed that they continue voting for other candidates. He considers himself the natural beneficiary of their votes, ignoring his own flip-flopping past, and when you support Arlen Specter, that's all pro-lifers need to know. You're finished. It's the same syndrome that Mitt Romney runs into. Romneycare and his support for choice on abortion in Massachusetts alone are enough to alienate a majority of Republican voters. Nonetheless, Santorum represents the views of the professional Catholic political establishment. After his defeat, he joined the same think tank that Elliott Abrams has run in the 1990s. Abrams, who pleaded guilty to federal charges of withholding information from Congress in '91, was pardoned by Bush 41 the next year. Wonder of wonders, he was nonetheless hired by Bush 43 to run his Middle East foreign policy at the NSC. Abrams undoubtedly shares some blame for the ensuing Iraq disaster, but like his fellow failures, he has never apologized either. Neocons never do. Losers seem to flock together, alas, and to persist now. Santorum pouts that the U.S. has lost the war and blames Obama. Only Ron Paul dares to remind the Republican pygmies that all the country's problems did not begin on January 20th, 2009. He adds that Republican Congresses were also complicit in Bush's domestic failures and his unconstitutional foreign wars. Such honesty is so refreshing that Washington's establishment, where down is up, finds it asphyxiating. The hot tub crowd returns the favor by doing everything it can to suck the air out of Ron Paul's campaign, because every one of the other current GOP candidates suffer from flaws that would be fatal in the real world. Ron Paul might wind up as the last man standing. Hot tubbers would be aghast, of course, but if Ron Paul wins the nomination, can we expect some professional Catholics to foment an undercurrent of resentment and retaliation? It does not matter that America's Catholic bishops have finally discovered that the Obama administration is the most anti-Catholic, anti-Christian administration in history. For these diehards, Obama is just the competition. Ron Paul is the enemy. After all, self-vindication is a high priority inside the Beltway, right up there with the endless wars. Why else did God invent memoirs? And that concludes the article. There's a lot of stuff in this article that I agree with and that I think is good to point out. However, one of the points that I strongly believe is being missed here by Mr. Mannion is a good amount of history regarding Rome's stance on economics. When you look in Europe, wherever you find politically active Roman Catholics, you don't find capitalists, you don't find free marketers, you don't find libertarians. You find social democrats. You find so-called middle-of-the-road third-way quasi-fascistic corporatists who think that government and industry must be joined at the hip and must partner up together in order to keep the economy going. This is exactly the same ideology that America is currently under the tyranny of, only we have the delusion of thinking that we're still living in a free market, and thus we provide fodder for demagoguing fools churned out of the Jesuit schools such as Michael Moore, who insists that capitalism is destroying the country, and then yet later admitting that we don't actually have a fully capitalist system. There are a lot of points that I could get into regarding the Jesuit order and how they are basically at the forefront of destroying what little bit of capitalism is left in America, but instead what I'm going to do for the remainder of this video is I am going to focus in particularly on something that is a bit older than the Jesuits and something that has been a critical flaw in Roman Catholicism and also to an extent also in Eastern Orthodoxy, and it has to do specifically with monasticism and the vows that go with them. And for those of you that may wonder, as a post-Port Royal Jansenist living in the modern era, there are some differences of opinion that I have with Bishop Jansen and with all of the people at the Port Royal convent. And that is, I do not believe in the sacrament of holy orders. As a result, I'm actually at odds with them. I'm in perfect communion with the old Catholic Church on this point because they've also gotten rid of monastical vows, probably because they have a much better grasp of Scripture. But the old Jansenists were still largely in agreement that monastic vows were a valid way of serving God. I'm just going to briefly touch upon the three things that are most cherished within monasteries. And this is actually something that was noted by Bill Press, the famed lunatic liberal, who has his own radio show that frequently gets featured on Radio Equalizer. The three virtues espoused in monastic religious life are poverty, singleness, and obedience. Now, what's missing from these three things? Just to start off with before I deal with each one specifically. Poverty, chastity, or single life is actually the more appropriate term, and obedience. Well, honesty is obviously missing from the equation now, isn't it? Where's honesty in this equation? Where's adherence to law? Well, they would argue obedience, but obedience to what? And this is where we need to get specific. In regards to the vow of chastity, the practical outworkings of this are not what they seem. What a monastery demands of a monk, either a religious monk or a teaching priest, is perpetual single life. And since the sacrament of confession has been so grossly cheapened by the Jesuits that a mere attritional fear of hell is sufficient for expiation, You can violate the implicit vow of chastity that they claim is worked into that perpetual single life vow in a number of different ways and simply confess it, and you're off the hook, at least according to the church. It's not really much of a wonder why sexual perversion and hypocrisy is so rampant amongst Catholic priests and monks, and why, if you read the history of Catholic holy orders, it is rampant with infidelity, with whoremongering, and with buggery. When you hold as a virtue the notion that perpetual single life, which I argue is something that no man born in sin is capable of, above the lawful and approved institution of marriage, you're opening the door to all kinds of things. And there's scripture that agrees very fervently with me on this. And I'm actually going to cite some of it for you right now, just so you can have just a little taste of where Rome is very much missing the boat on these things. But ask yourself just this question. Are monastical vows of perpetual single life in accordance with the Bible? Well, let's look up a couple verses and see here. I'm going to start with the book of Acts. And the specific verse that I'm going to look up is Acts chapter 20, verses 12 and 14. And I'm going to read this out of the King James Version, since that's the version that is most widely known, and also because when you take the direct English translation of the Vulgate, it sounds extremely archaic, even when compared to the archaic Old New English King James Version. Acts 23, verse 12. And when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. 14. And they came to the chief priests and elders and said, We have bound ourselves under a great curse that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul. These were people that profess to believe in the Ten Commandments. And I'm using this just to start off with what these illicit vows can lead to. The Ten Commandments specifically state, Thou shalt not kill. These people in the book of Acts are asking God to help them in breaking one of his commandments. And furthermore, they attach to it a vow that they will not eat or drink. In other words, they won't follow the command to preserve their own lives, as they are also created in the image of God, thus compounding the error. So this is just to give you a little taste of what happens, what can happen when you get out of control with vowing to do things, essentially putting a hedgerow before the hedgerow and saying, I'm going to go above and beyond the call of duty. I am not only going to follow the Ten Commandments, I am actually going to go beyond them in the name of serving God. Or in serving his church, actually, is the more appropriate term. Okay, now, for something specific pertaining to what I stated about marriage. Let's go to the gospel here. Matthew 19, verses 11 and 12. Here we go. But he said unto them, All men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs which were born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. But, now mind you, but, here it's establishing the actual ability to do this. And when the Bible talks about eunuchs, in the case of being born from it, they're being born being able to abstain. Not that they're born missing the equipment, just so there's no confusion there. And it's the same with all of the others, whether they're doing it for a part of their life or the majority of their life because they've devoted themselves to some specific work that's laid out in the gospel. Now, we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 2 and 9. Here we go. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Verse 9. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Ask yourselves about this.